People in Dust Creek used to say that trouble always rides into town on horseback, but on that quiet evening no one expected it to arrive with a stranger and a girl no one recognized. The sun was sinking low over the dry Arizona hills, painting the wooden storefronts in long amber shadows as the wind carried thin clouds of dust along the empty main street. Dust Creek was a small town, the kind where everyone knew each other's name, the kind where strangers were noticed the moment their boots touched the boardwalk. That was why every conversation stopped when the sound of slow hoofbeats echoed from the western road. A tall bay horse stepped into view first, its pace steady but tired after what must have been miles across the desert. Sitting in the saddle was a lone cowboy, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low against the fading sunlight, his coat dusty from travel. No one in Dust Creek recognized him, but that wasn't what made the townsfolk stare. Behind him on the same saddle, holding lightly to the back of his coat, was a young native girl. Her dark hair moved gently in the wind, and although she looked exhausted from the journey, there was something calm and steady in her eyes as she looked across the quiet street. The cowboy slowed the horse near the water trough in front of Miller's General Store, letting the animal drink as he glanced around the town like a man measuring the weight of a place before speaking. On the wooden porch nearby, 3 locals paused their conversation, their eyes fixed on the unusual pair. In a town like Dust Creek, people traveled through now and then, cattle drivers, traders, the occasional drifter looking for work, but a stranger arriving with a native girl behind him was not something folks saw every day. One man leaned slightly closer to the others and muttered under his breath that the stranger must have come a long way, judging by the dust on his boots and the tired look in the horse's stride. Another man quietly wondered why the girl said nothing, why she simply watched the town as if she were studying every face she saw. The cowboy finally dismounted, his boots touching the ground with a quiet thud, and for a moment he rested a steady hand on the horse's neck before helping the girl down carefully. She stepped onto the dirt road without a word, standing beside him with the quiet confidence of someone who had been through more than the journey suggested. The stranger tipped his hat slightly toward the general store, as if acknowledging the curious eyes watching from every porch and window. What the people of Dust Creek didn't know yet was that earlier that same afternoon, Sheriff William Dalton had sent riders in 3 different directions searching for someone important who had disappeared beyond the hills. And what the cowboy standing beside the water trough didn't know was that the entire town had been waiting all day for news that had not come. For a few long seconds the street remained silent except for the gentle sound of water splashing from the trough and the soft creak of a swinging saloon sign down the road. Then one of the townsmen spoke quietly enough that only those closest could hear it. He said the stranger might want to explain where he found the girl before the sheriff returned from his search. The cowboy looked up slowly at the words, calm and unreadable, as the last light of the sun slipped behind the distant mesas, and somewhere beyond the hills a rider was already on his way back to Dust Creek, carrying news that would change how every person in that town looked at the quiet cowboy who had just arrived. The quiet tension along the street did not fade after the cowboy helped the girl down from the horse. If anything, the silence seemed to stretch longer as more people slowly stepped out onto the wooden boardwalks to see the stranger for themselves. Dust Creek was not the kind of place where unexpected things happened without everyone noticing. Windows opened slightly. A door creaked as someone leaned out from the barber shop. Even the bartender inside the saloon paused mid-conversation to glance through the swinging doors. The cowboy moved with calm, deliberate motions, as if he had traveled through towns like this many times before. He untied a small canteen from the saddle and handed it gently to the girl. She accepted it with a quiet nod, drinking slowly while keeping her eyes on the street ahead of her. There was something thoughtful about the way she observed the town, as though every face and every building meant something. She was trying to understand. The cowboy then removed his hat for a moment, brushing dust from the brim before placing it back on his head. His expression remained steady and patient, but the people watching him were already forming their own stories. A woman standing near the bakery whispered that the girl looked tired, like someone who had traveled for hours under the desert sun. A ranch hand leaning against a post replied that strangers sometimes passed through the territory with unusual companions, but something about this pair felt different. Meanwhile, the 3 men who had first noticed the rider were still watching closely. One of them finally stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the water trough, stopping several feet away as if measuring the distance between curiosity and caution. He greeted the cowboy with a polite nod and asked where the road had taken him from that afternoon. The cowboy answered simply that he had come across the western ridge, about 20 miles outside of town. His voice carried the easy tone of someone used to long rides and open country. The man glanced briefly at the girl before asking if the journey had been difficult. The cowboy replied that the desert could be harsh late in the day, but the road had been clear enough to travel. The girl said nothing during the exchange, though her calm gaze shifted between the two men as if she understood every word. By now several more townsfolk had gathered along the boardwalks, and their quiet conversations drifted across the street like the evening wind. Someone mentioned that Sheriff William Dalton had been searching the hills since morning. Another person quietly wondered whether the stranger had crossed paths with the sheriff during his ride. The cowboy seemed to notice the direction of the whispers, but did not respond to them. Instead, he gently adjusted the saddle blanket on his horse and gave the animal a reassuring pat on the neck. The horse lifted its head from the trough, water dripping slowly back into the wooden basin. At that moment, the distant sound of approaching hooves echoed faintly from the far end of the road beyond the town. A few people turned their heads toward the sound at once. Riders often came and went from Dust Creek, but the rhythm of the approaching horse carried a sense of urgency that made the street grow quiet again. The girl lowered the canteen and looked toward the horizon as well, her expression suddenly thoughtful in a way that made it seem as though she recognized exactly who might be returning to town. The distant hoofbeats grew louder as the rider approached the edge of Dust Creek, and the quiet street slowly shifted from curiosity to expectation. Several townspeople stepped down from the wooden boardwalks and moved closer to the center of the street, shading their eyes from the fading sunlight to see who was coming. The cowboy standing beside the trough noticed the movement but remained calm, resting one hand lightly on the saddle as if he had all the time in the world. The girl beside him had finished drinking from the canteen and now stood quietly, her eyes fixed on the distant road where the approaching horse was beginning to take shape against the dusty horizon. Within a few moments the rider came fully into view, guiding a strong gray horse down the main street with steady purpose. The man wore the familiar star-shaped badge that every person in Dust Creek recognized immediately. Sheriff William Dalton had returned from the hills. His hat sat low over his brow, and his long coat moved gently in the evening breeze as he slowed his horse near the center of town. The sheriff had spent the entire day riding across miles of dry canyon roads searching for someone who had vanished beyond the ridge that morning, and the tension of that long search could be seen in the careful way he studied every face along the street. When he finally noticed the unfamiliar cowboy standing beside the trough, his attention sharpened at once. The sheriff guided his horse a few yards closer and brought it to a calm stop, the animal shifting its weight softly on the packed dirt road. For a brief moment he said nothing, simply observing the stranger, the horse, and the girl standing quietly beside him. Around them the town had fallen silent again, as though every person understood that whatever happened next might explain the uneasy rumors that had been spreading all afternoon. Sheriff Dalton stepped down from the saddle with measured patience, tying the reins loosely to the hitching post before turning back toward the cowboy. His voice was calm, but carried the authority of a man used to keeping order in a frontier town. He greeted the stranger and asked where the road had brought him from that evening. The cowboy answered in the same steady tone he had used earlier, explaining that he had ridden across the western ridge shortly before sunset. The sheriff listened carefully, his eyes shifting for a moment toward the girl. Something about her presence made his expression tighten slightly, though he did not yet speak of it. Instead, he asked another simple question about whether the cowboy had seen anyone else traveling through the hills that day. The cowboy paused for a second as though considering how best to answer. The townspeople watching from the boardwalks leaned forward quietly, sensing the weight behind the conversation even if they did not yet understand why. The girl lifted her gaze toward the sheriff, and for the first time since arriving in town a faint recognition seemed to pass across her face. Sheriff Dalton noticed it too, though he could not immediately place the feeling that stirred behind his careful expression. The desert wind moved gently along the street, carrying with it the distant smell of dry sage and the quiet anticipation of a truth that had not yet been spoken. The street of Dust Creek remained still as Sheriff William Dalton studied the stranger more closely, the fading sunlight stretching long shadows across the dirt road, while the quiet murmur of the town faded into complete silence. The sheriff was a man known for patience, someone who believed that answers revealed themselves when people were given enough time to speak, and for that reason he did not rush the moment. He stepped a little closer, resting one hand calmly near the front of his belt, not as a threat, but as the natural posture of a lawman who had spent many years standing exactly this way in exactly this kind of town. His eyes moved from the cowboy's weathered hat to the dust along his coat, then briefly toward the horse that had clearly traveled many miles across dry land. Finally his attention returned to the girl standing beside the stranger. She remained quiet, her posture steady even with the weight of so many curious eyes watching her. The sheriff asked again where the cowboy had come from, and whether he had seen anyone else along the western ridge during the afternoon. The cowboy answered respectfully, explaining that he had been riding alone through the hills when he noticed the girl walking along the edge of a narrow canyon road several miles from the nearest ranch trail. According to his account, the desert sun had been strong and the wind had begun to pick up dust from the dry ground, so he offered her water and a ride toward the nearest town. The explanation was simple, but it caused a quiet wave of whispers among the people gathered along the boardwalks. Some nodded slowly, as if the story sounded reasonable enough, while others exchanged uncertain glances, still unsure what to make of the situation. One ranch hand quietly mentioned that the western ridge stretched nearly 30 miles of open country, with very few places for someone to travel on foot alone. Another townsman pointed out that Sheriff Dalton had spent the entire day searching those same hills for someone who had not returned home. The sheriff heard those whispers as well, though his face revealed little of what he was thinking. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the girl once more and spoke to her directly for the first time. His voice softened slightly as he asked if she had indeed been traveling through the canyon road earlier that afternoon. For a moment she did not answer. The wind lifted a strand of her dark hair across her face, while she looked carefully at the sheriff, as though weighing something important in her mind. The townspeople leaned forward quietly, sensing that the silence carried meaning they could not yet understand. The cowboy did not interrupt or attempt to explain further. He simply stood beside the trough with the calm patience of someone who believed the truth would soon speak for itself. The girl finally lifted her head a little higher, her eyes steady now as she looked directly at the sheriff, and the quiet expression on her face carried a strange familiarity that Sheriff Dalton could feel even if he could not yet explain why. Somewhere in the distance a loose shutter tapped softly against the side of the saloon building, and the entire street seemed to hold its breath as the moment stretched toward a revelation none of them had expected. The silence stretched across the street as the girl held Sheriff Dalton's gaze, and for a moment it felt as though the entire town of Dust Creek had stopped moving. The sheriff waited patiently, but the quiet expression on his face had begun to change in small ways that only someone paying close attention might notice. There was a faint tightening around his eyes, the look of a man trying to recognize something just beyond his memory. The girl seemed to sense it too. She took a slow breath, her shoulders lifting slightly as though she had traveled much farther than the dusty road suggested. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear enough for the sheriff to hear without difficulty. She said that the cowboy had told the truth. She had been walking along the canyon road earlier that afternoon when the sun was still high above the ridge, and the desert wind had begun to push long trails of dust across the path. She explained that she had been trying to find her way back toward town after becoming separated from the road that led through the hills. The cowboy had noticed her from horseback and offered water before asking if she needed help reaching the nearest settlement. The townspeople listening along the boardwalks exchanged quiet looks with one another. The story sounded simple, and the calm way the girl spoke made it difficult to imagine any reason she would say otherwise. Sheriff Dalton nodded slowly as he listened, though the strange familiarity in the girl's voice continued to stir a quiet sense of recognition within him. He asked her another question, this time more gently than before, wondering how long she had been traveling alone through the desert. The girl paused briefly before answering that it had only been a few hours, though the distance had felt much longer beneath the afternoon sun. As she spoke, she took a small step forward into the fading light, and that movement allowed the sheriff to see her face more clearly than before. Something about the shape of her eyes, The calm steadiness in the way she looked at him struck a deeper chord in his memory. For an instant the sheriff seemed uncertain, as if a long-forgotten image was beginning to rise in his thoughts, but had not yet fully revealed itself. The cowboy remained quiet beside the trough, watching the exchange without interfering, his expression steady and respectful, as though he understood the importance of the moment. One of the townsmen near the barber shop shifted his weight and whispered to the man beside him that the sheriff looked as if he had just remembered something important. Another person murmured that perhaps the girl had family somewhere nearby after all. The desert wind carried their whispers across the street, but the sheriff barely seemed to hear them now. His attention remained fixed on the girl standing a few feet away from him. After a long pause, he spoke again, asking a final question that carried a weight none of the others had held. He asked the girl her name. The moment the words left his mouth, the entire street fell completely still again, because even the people watching from the far end of the boardwalk understood that whatever answer came next might explain the strange feeling that had settled over Dust Creek since the cowboy first rode into town. The question hung quietly in the warm evening air as every person along the street waited for the girl to answer. Sheriff William Dalton stood still in front of her, his eyes steady but searching, as though the name he was about to hear might unlock a memory that had been just beyond his reach all afternoon. The girl looked at him calmly, the fading sunlight reflecting softly across her face while the desert wind moved gently along the dusty road behind her. For a moment, she seemed to study the sheriff in the same careful way he had been studying her. Then she spoke. She told him her name was Emily. The moment the name left her lips, something changed in the sheriff's expression. It was small at first, barely noticeable to the townspeople watching from the boardwalks, but inside his mind the sound of that name stirred a memory he had not allowed himself to fully face since the search had begun that morning. Emily Dalton was the name of his daughter. The same daughter who had ridden out beyond the hills earlier that day and had not returned by sunset. The sheriff's gaze sharpened slightly as the thought crossed his mind, but the difference between the girl standing before him and the daughter he had known for years created a hesitation he could not immediately resolve. The girl's clothing carried the colors and patterns of native tradition, and the long road had left dust along the edges of her boots. Yet there was something in her eyes, something familiar in the quiet steadiness of her voice, that made the sheriff's heart begin to beat a little faster. The townspeople watching nearby noticed the change in his posture. One of the ranch hands whispered that the sheriff looked as though he had just heard the answer to a question he had been asking himself all day. Another man quietly replied that perhaps the name meant something important to him. The cowboy remained silent beside the trough, observing the moment without speaking. He understood that the truth unfolding in the middle of the street belonged to the girl and the sheriff alone. Emily continued speaking calmly, explaining that earlier in the afternoon she had ridden out beyond the ridge to follow a narrow trail she had heard about from one of the ranch families outside town. She had hoped to find a quiet place along the canyon where the wind moved through the tall desert grass. But while traveling along the trail, her horse had become startled by the sudden gusts sweeping through the rocky pass. The horse had run farther down the canyon than she expected, leaving her separated from the road she normally followed back to Dust Creek. She had spent several hours walking through the dry hills trying to find the path again before the cowboy came riding along the canyon road and offered to help her reach town before nightfall. The sheriff listened to every word without interruption. As she spoke, he began to notice more details that stirred recognition within him. The sound of her voice, the calm determination in the way she explained what had happened, the same quiet confidence he had seen many times before in the daughter he had raised. And slowly the truth began to settle into place in his mind as he looked at the girl standing before him in the fading light. The sheriff remained silent for several long seconds after hearing the name, and the quiet tension in the middle of Dust Creek grew even deeper. The desert wind moved softly through the street, stirring small trails of dust along the ground while the townspeople watched with careful attention. Sheriff William Dalton had faced many difficult moments during his years as the lawman of the town, but none of them had carried the strange mixture of doubt and hope that now settled inside his chest. He looked at the girl again, more carefully this time, searching her face for details he had somehow overlooked in the fading evening light. The longer he studied her, the more the pieces began to align with memories he knew well. The shape of her eyes was the same as the young girl who had once followed him along the boardwalk as a child. The calm steadiness in her voice carried the same quiet confidence he had heard during countless conversations at the dinner table inside his home. Even the way she stood with her shoulders relaxed but alert felt familiar to him. Yet there was still something different that held him back from speaking the thought forming in his mind. The clothing she wore reflected the traditions of the native families who lived along the valley beyond the hills, and the long road she had traveled had given her an appearance that no one in town expected to see that evening. The sheriff finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, asking the girl one more question that only someone who truly knew Emily Dalton could answer without hesitation. He asked her what trail she had taken beyond the ridge that afternoon, the exact path that curved between two tall sandstone formations before reaching the narrow canyon road. The girl listened to the question and answered without pause, describing the same winding trail that led past a cluster of old juniper trees where the ground dipped slightly before rising toward the ridge. She even mentioned the broken wooden fence that marked the edge of the Dalton Ranch boundary, a detail few people outside the family would have noticed. As soon as she spoke those words, the last trace of uncertainty faded from the sheriff's face. A deep breath escaped him as the realization settled fully into place. The girl standing in front of him was not a stranger who simply shared his daughter's name. She was his daughter. The townspeople watching nearby noticed the shift at once. The sheriff, who had returned from the hills looking tense and determined, now seemed overwhelmed by a different emotion entirely. He stepped closer to the girl, studying her face once more as though confirming what his heart already knew. The girl met his gaze calmly and finally spoke again, this time with a gentle warmth in her voice that carried through the silent street. She told him that she had not meant to worry him. She had simply wanted to explore the canyon trail she had heard about from the native families who often traveled through the valley, and she had chosen clothing that would help her travel quietly along the desert paths without drawing attention. The cowboy standing beside the trough listened quietly as the truth unfolded, understanding now why the girl had remained calm during the long ride toward town. What had begun as a simple act of kindness on a lonely canyon road had led him directly into the center of a moment that would soon change how the entire town of Dust Creek saw him. For several seconds the street remained completely silent as the realization settled over Sheriff William Dalton and the people watching from the boardwalks. The man who had spent the entire day riding across the dry hills searching for his missing daughter now stood only a few feet away from her, and the truth of it slowly replaced the tension that had followed him back into town. The sheriff let out a long breath he had not realized he had been holding, the weight of worry lifting from his shoulders as he looked at Emily again with clearer eyes. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, the kind that only confirmed what he already knew in his heart. Around them, the townspeople began exchanging quiet murmurs of surprise. Word traveled quickly in a place like Dust Creek, but no one had expected the girl the stranger brought into town to be the very person the sheriff had been searching for since morning. The ranch hands who had been whispering earlier now looked toward the cowboy with completely different expressions. What they had first assumed to be a strange situation was now something far simpler and far more honorable. The sheriff turned his attention briefly toward the cowboy standing beside the trough. Until that moment, the stranger had remained calm and respectful, never interrupting the conversation or demanding recognition for what he had done. Sheriff Dalton studied him for a moment before speaking. His voice carried both authority and genuine gratitude as he asked the cowboy his name. The cowboy tipped his hat politely and introduced himself as Jack Carter, explaining that he had been traveling through the territory for several weeks, moving between ranch work and long rides across the open desert. Sheriff Dalton nodded thoughtfully as he listened. He then said something that carried clearly through the quiet street so that everyone standing nearby could hear it. He told Jack Carter that earlier that morning he had feared the worst when his daughter did not return from the hills, and that every mile he rode searching for her had felt longer than the one before. Now he understood that the stranger standing before him had been the reason Emily reached town safely before nightfall. The sheriff stepped forward and extended his hand in a gesture that carried deep meaning in a frontier town where respect was not given lightly. Jack accepted the handshake with quiet humility. The moment did not last long, but the townspeople watching understood its importance. In a place where reputation often shaped how a man was treated, The sheriff's public gratitude meant more than any explanation could have. Emily looked between the two men and quietly added that Jack had not only offered her water and a ride, but had stayed beside her during the long road back to Dust Creek, even though he could have easily continued his own journey across the territory. Her words caused another ripple of murmurs among the people gathered along the street. The same stranger they had been quietly questioning only minutes earlier now stood recognized as someone who had shown kindness when it mattered most. The evening light faded slowly across the town as the desert sky turned deeper shades of orange and purple, and for the first time since the Cowboy rode into Dust Creek, the tension that had filled the air began to dissolve into a calm sense of understanding. As the evening light continued to fade over Dust Creek, the quiet street slowly began to return to its usual rhythm, but the moment that had unfolded in the center of town would not be forgotten anytime soon. Sheriff William Dalton released Jack Carter's hand and stepped slightly closer to his daughter, the deep concern that had followed him across miles of desert now replaced with relief that softened his voice. He asked Emily if she was feeling well after the long walk through the canyon trails, and she assured him that she was simply tired from the hours beneath the afternoon sun. The sheriff nodded, still studying her carefully the way a father does when he has just found something he feared might be lost. Around them, the townspeople who had gathered along the boardwalks began to relax, the earlier tension replaced by quiet conversations and small smiles of understanding. A few of the ranch hands stepped down from the porch near the general store and approached the water trough, offering friendly greetings to Jack Carter that carried none of the suspicion they had shown before. Word had already begun to spread from one end of the street to the other that the stranger had helped bring the sheriff's daughter safely back to town, and in a place like Dust Creek that kind of story traveled quickly. Emily glanced toward Jack and thanked him once more for stopping along the canyon road when he saw her walking alone through the desert. She explained that the wind had grown stronger along the ridge and the trail markers were harder to follow than she expected, but Jack had offered help without hesitation even though he had no reason to know who she was. Jack answered simply that anyone riding through the open country understood the importance of helping a traveler who might need it. Sheriff Dalton listened to the exchange and then looked down the long street of Dust Creek, the lanterns in front of the saloon and the general store beginning to glow softly as evening settled across the town. He said that a man who showed that kind of decency on the open road was always welcome in Dust Creek, whether he planned to stay a night or only pass through on his journey. The words carried clearly enough that the people nearby heard them as well, and several of them nodded in quiet agreement. Jack tipped his hat politely, grateful for the kindness, but showing no sign of expecting praise for what he had done. His horse finished drinking from the trough and lifted its head as the last colors of sunset faded beyond the western ridge. Emily stepped beside her father and looked down the street that led toward the Dalton Ranch outside town, knowing that the long day was finally coming to an end. Before leaving, Sheriff Dalton turned back to Jack once more and told him that if he ever rode through Dust Creek again, he would find a warm meal and a place to rest waiting for him at the Dalton Ranch. Jack gave a small nod of appreciation, and with that the quiet moment closed as naturally as it had begun, leaving the town with a simple story that would be told for years whenever someone asked about the evening a stranger rode into Dust Creek and reminded everyone that kindness on the open road could change the course of an entire day.